Emmett Till, born on July 25, 1941, was an African American who resided in the northern city of Chicago. In 1955, when Emmett was 14 years old, he visited his family in the vastly different southern Jim Crow state of Mississippi. While visiting his family, Emmett was accused of harassing Caroline Bryant, a white woman, which at the time was a dangerous crime. 60 years after the fact, Bryant admitted she had fabricated the entire story, but it was far too late. After hearing about the alleged harassment, Carolyn's husband Roy Bryant and his brother-in-law J.W. Millam raced into Emmett's uncle's house. They ended up brutally beating, mutilating, and ultimately murdering Emmett Till, tossing his mangled body into the Tallahatchie River with the fan of a cotton gin tied around his neck to weigh him down. When the murder case went to trial, Bryant and Millam were both completely acquitted, meaning they faced no penalty, by an all-white, all-male jury, sparking outrage that extended far beyond the African American community, even reaching the Northern magazine Look, who regarded this case as an approved killing. The press went crazy. In order to maintain this momentum, Till's mother, Mamie Till, had an open casket ceremony to show the world what had been done to her son. Emmett Till's death wasn't in vain, however, as it forced open the eyes of America to the callous and vicious racism that, even almost 100 years after slavery was abolished, was still alive and flourishing in the South.
A crash shook the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama on Sunday, September 15, 1963, at 10:22 a.m. A dynamite bomb had then been thrown into the ladies' lounge in the church basement from a moving car, caused severe property damage, and, among the rubble, 4 bodies were found. Reverend John Cross, pastor of the church at the time, along with congregants and parents, identified the bodies as 4 young girls who had been preparing for Sunday school. The first child, Denise McNair, at 11 years old, was described by family and neighbors as charming, lovable, caring, helpful, friendly, happy, feisty, and inquisitive. That day, Denise left for church with her mother, Maxine, leaving her father, Chris, and dog, Whitey, at home. Hers was the only mother of the 4 young women who attended church that day. The second, Carol Robertson, was 14 years old and active in her church community. She was an honor roll student, an avid reader, outgoing, beautiful, and friendly, according to relatives and friends. Carol was also a leader, a member of Girl Scouts as well as Jack and Jill of America, a leadership movement for African American children. She played clarinet and should have performed on Monday the 16th. The third body, recognizable only by her clothing, was Cynthia Dion Wesley. Cynthia was also 14 years old and, according to family and friends, lived a normal life. Adopted at a young age, Cynthia was described as well-liked and humorous and was to begin her ushering duties at church that day. The youngest of the 4, Addie Mae Collins, was only 10 at the time of the bombing. Those who knew her said she was withdrawn, yet sweet and a peacemaker, especially among her family. With a knack for baseball, Addie Mae was said to have a baffling underhand motion. 22 others were injured in the bombing, including Sarah Collins, Addie Mae's 12-year-old sister, who, while being loaded into an ambulance, shards of glass embedded in both eyes, yelled for Addie. The killers were Klansmen, including Robert Dynamite Bob Chambliss, who was tried and convicted in 1977, Thomas Blanton, tried in 2001 and convicted the same year, Bobby Cherry, tried in 2001 and convicted in 2002, and Herman Cash, the only terrorist never convicted of his crimes having to do with the bombing. In the aftermath of the attack, 2 other African Americans were shot and killed. One, Johnny Robinson, who, at 16 years old, was shot after refusing to listen to police orders to stop stoning cars belonging to whites, and Virgil Ware, who was killed for no reason at 13 while riding his bike outside the city. Despite the tragedy's fame, bombing was common in Birmingham, dubbed Bombingham at the time. Hate crimes similar to this one occurred frequently, and the attacks often resulted in property damage and injury. But the church bombing of 1963 was the first time that any fatalities were recorded due to white-on-black violence. And yet, as many tragedies do, the Alabama church bombing inspired many people to speak out. In this case, formerly silent Americans were driven to take a stand for African American rights, leading to the creation of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which protected blacks from being discriminated against in the workplace. and was directly to the establishment of voting rights for African Americans.
The Black Panther Party was a defining movement during the Civil Rights era, and without it, our country would not be where it is today in terms of civil rights. In between the Civil War and 1954, African Americans and whites were segregated in every social situation. This included water fountains, bathrooms, and schools. In the Supreme Court case, Brown v. the Board of Education, the Supreme Court voted that segregation in public schools went against the Constitution. Much to the dismay of many Southerners, all American schools became integrated. Although the civil rights movement was making progress, the African Americans were still working low-income jobs and living lesser lives than the whites in their country. As a result of this, the Black Power movement was created. This term, popularized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a branch of the Black Power movement, allowed for African Americans to interpret their own meaning of Black Power. Two major leaders in the Black Power movement were men named Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. King was a peaceful man who dreamed of equality and the disappearance of racial segregation and bias. Malcolm X, on the other hand, preached that blacks should be voluntarily separate from the whites. The Black Panther Party was inspired by these two men and their ideas. The Black Panther Party was initially founded to track police brutality in Oakland, California. The members generally wore dark blue or black and carried large guns around in public areas. The spreading of the Black Panther Party caused many conflicts between the members of the party and white police officers. In October 1967, a violent gun battle between the Black Panthers and the police broke out. This incident left one officer wounded and one dead. Another incident of violence was with a young party member, Alex Rackley. Rackley was accused by other Panthers as being a police informant. He was brutally tortured and murdered by the people he believed were his friends. These incidents allowed the whites to label the Black Panthers as a black nationalist hate group. Stop the War Now, The Crisis of the Black Panther Party was written by Henry Winston to describe the difficulties of the Black Panthers. The pamphlet argued that the ideals of the Black Panthers were correct, and they were only trying to help the African American community deprived of high-income jobs and equality. Sadly, by the 1970s, the Black Power movement disappeared, along with the Black Panther Party and the healthily segregated future they had envisioned.
In May of 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case Brown v. the Board of Education, ruled that segregated schools were inherently unequal, therefore pronouncing them illegal. In the days following the ruling, the Little Rock High School Board in Little Rock, Arkansas, issued a policy stating it would comply with the court's decision. This idea was explosive within the community, and like much of the South, it was fraught with anger and bitterness. 3 years later, 9 African American students enrolled in the all-white high school. These students soon became known as Little Rock 9. The struggle that ensued between segregationists, integrationists, the state of Arkansas, and the federal government gained worldwide attention. On September 2, 1957, the night prior to what was going to be the teens' first day in Central High classrooms, Arkansas's governor, Orville Faubus, ordered the state's National Guard to block their entrance. Faubus claimed that he did this for the safety of the 9 students, although this was most likely not the true intentions of the known racist governor. When the 9 students arrived for their first day of school, the guardsmen blocked their entrance. However, after a federal judge ruled that Governor Faubus was using the troops to prevent integration, not to preserve law and order as he claimed, the guardsmen were removed. On September 23rd, the 9 students entered the school through a side door as an angry white mob gathered in the front of the school. When the mob learned that the teens were already inside, they became unruly. One of the 9 students, Elizabeth Eckford, was jeered and cursed by the white mob and narrowly escaped injury. One man was clubbed and another was stabbed in the arm by soldiers in fights that followed. Fearing for the lives of the 9 students, school officials sent the teens home. They did, however, manage to attend classes for 3 hours. President Eisenhower hosted Orville Faubus at his summer home in Rhode Island, urging the governor to end his obstructions of court orders. On September 24th, the mayor of Little Rock 9 sent a telegram to President Eisenhower asking for help to maintain order and continue with the integration process. Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas's National Guard, taking control of them away from Governor Faubus. The following day, under the protection of 1,000 members of the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army, the Little Rock 9 entered the school to attend classes. Army troops stayed for over 2 months to curb threats of mob violence at Central High. Eventually, though, the federal troops were withdrawn. Additionally, federalized guard units remained until the school year ended. Despite this, the teens were taunted, spit on, and even received death threats. Many white parents pulled their children out of schools as they had not yet accepted the idea of integration. That spring, on May 27, 1958, Ernest Green became the first African American to graduate from Central High. The flood of emotions and backlash that these young students had to endure every day is unimaginable. Each day, they had to muster so much courage just to walk into their own school. Little Rock 9 was an extremely important event in the civil rights movement because although the students were not initially welcomed, this event was a step in the right direction to.
On August 28, 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom came to action with over 200,000 participants. After Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Black Americans continued to suffer injustices politically and economically. People of color experienced discrimination, segregation, unemployment, poor job mobility, and low wages. Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph started planning a march on Washington, D.C., had many meetings, and during the summer of 1963, many organizations planned on participating in the march and many supported the protest. These are Rustin and Randolph's goals: to have 100,000 people participate in the march, a civil rights bill that would end segregation, have the right to vote, and fair employment. Although they had a lot of support from organizations, groups, and the public, many feared political controversy, threats, violence, and riots, especially from the American Nazi Party as well as other racist organizations. Finally, over 200,000 people of all colors participated in the March on Washington in the late summer of 1963. Although there were some threats of violence, the day was calm. For the duration of the march, there were speeches given by civil rights leaders, from Roy Wilkins to Whitney Young and John Lewis. Along with the speeches, there were musicians like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Marian Anderson, Mahalia Jackson, and others who performed during the march. Although there were many important people at the march and many speeches, the highlight of the march was Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Martin discussed wanting everyone to be treated equally and to live up to the "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal" that's in the Constitution. He continued on by hoping that one day, sons of former slaves and former slave owners will be able to sit together on the table of brotherhood. Lastly, he hoped that one day his children will be able to live in a nation where they won't be judged by the color of their skin, but by who they are inside. Other than MLK's speech, people discussed needing change, needing equality, needing to help each other, and to keep fighting for rights. Along with that, they also discussed wanting freedom, employment, pride, and respect. They decided enough was enough of feeling sick of discrimination and jokes towards people of color. Lastly, they needed access to public accommodations, decent housing, the right to vote, education, no segregation of school districts, enforce the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship to anyone born in the U.S., and protects civil and political liberties, and the Minimum Wage Act. After the march, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders met with President JFK to talk about the need for civil rights legislation.
But after all of this, hate still exists. And it's up to us to stop it. Support movements, call out bigotry, protest injustice. Do whatever you can to make the world a better place. And never stay silent.